Before the war was over, before victory parades, medals, and history books, the US Army made a quiet decision, not on a battlefield, not against the enemy, but against one of its own. In a war where fear was common, desertion was widespread, and mercy was often shown, one man was chosen to die, not because he was the worst, not because he was the most dangerous, but because someone had to pay, and his name was Eddie Slovik. During World War II, more than 50,000 American soldiers deserted the battlefield. Thousands were caught. Thousands were tried. More than 21,000 were convicted. But only one faced the ultimate punishment. Only one was executed. He was just 24 years old. His name was Eddie Slovik. Eddie Slovik didn't fit the image people like to imagine when they hear the word soldier. He wasn't heroic. He wasn't brave in the traditional sense. He was never meant for posters or speeches. He was a deeply flawed, painfully ordinary man. Someone who grew up on the margins of society, surrounded by poverty, bad decisions, and trouble. He had a criminal record. He had been to prison. Life had never given him a clean start. When he was drafted into the Army, he didn't pretend to be fearless. He didn't lie. He didn't hide what he felt. He was afraid. Not a passing fear, but a constant, paralyzing fear. The kind that doesn't disappear with uniforms, slogans, or orders barked by officers. When the time came for him to return to the front lines, Eddie didn't do what thousands of others did. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He picked up a pen. He wrote down that he refused to go back into combat. He signed his name, and he handed the paper directly to his commanding officers. Again and again. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he understood the risks. But he believed one thing with certainty, that refusing to fight would not get him executed. At the same time, he understood something darker. The Army needed to make an example, and Eddie Slovik was the easiest choice. "Thousands of soldiers have deserted," he said. "You only need one to set an example, and that one is me, because I'm the easiest target." His trial wasn't just about what he did in the war. It was a judgment of his entire life. A child who had stolen, a teenager who had been imprisoned, a man with no moral credit left to spend. On January 31, 1945, in France, Eddie Slovik was tied to a wooden post. In front of him stood an American firing squad, 11 rifles. The order was given. After the first volley, he was still alive. The command was issued to reload. But before a second round could be fired, his body gave out. The entire execution took 15 minutes. Eddie Slovik became the only American soldier executed for desertion during World War II, while thousands of others lived. He died believing his life had been taken not for justice, but for a message. And he was not wrong. This story does not glorify cowardice. It does not excuse desertion. It points to something far more uncomfortable, that even the most disciplined systems do not apply justice equally, that wars judge not only actions, but the weight of a person's entire past. And when an example must be made, it is often not the most guilty who pay the price, but the most convenient. Eddie Slovik didn't live long enough for history to forgive him or redeem him. But his case still unsettles us today, because it leaves behind a question that refuses to disappear. When the message matters more than justice, who ends up paying the price? Eddie Slovik never claimed to be a hero. He never asked to be remembered. He didn't try to justify his fear or excuse his choice. He only asked to live. History would later debate his guilt, Lawyers would question the fairness of his sentence. Presidents would be asked to pardon him, and would refuse. Because once a system decides it needs a symbol, facts matter less than timing, and justice bends under pressure. Eddie Slovik was not executed because he was unique. He was executed because he was replaceable. And that is what makes his story unsettling. Not the fear, not the desertion, but the realization that when institutions need to send a message, they don't always choose the worst offender. They choose the easiest one. So the question remains, nearly 80 years later, when fear becomes policy and punishment becomes theater, who decides whose life is worth the message?